Now, to anybody paying attention right now, I certainly hope that it's become abundantly clear that this government, this federal government, and a lot of the provincial governments want nothing more than for Canadians to suffer as much as humanly possible, and it's all in the spirit of a big, massive virtue signal. We've got a number of governments in this country, liberal, conservative alike, who are all throwing the citizens of Canada under the bus in the spirit of one big, massive virtue signal on every single note that you could possibly imagine that you could virtue signal on. I mean, for example, you got Doug Ford now. He's propping up Justin Trudeau, thanking him for all of his support and talking about how well they can work together after spending 2 years punishing the citizens of Ontario. In fact, the citizens of Canada have been punished for 2 years straight. I mean, the entire last 2 years was built around the suffering of Canadians. We had to suffer despite the data saying we didn't have to suffer. Also, the government could virtue signal that everybody's going to be vaccinated, everybody's going to be masked, we're going to shut down all these businesses in the spirit of safety with no impact to safety whatsoever in a positive way. Last 2 years, we did that. So the last 2 years has been demonstrably spent making Canadians suffer in the spirit of virtue signaling to the rest of the world that we're doing all this wonderful stuff on COVID, and a bunch of premiers bought into this bullshit as well. So now we have the coalition. We've got the NDP Liberal Coalition. Now, they don't call it a coalition, but it's basically a coalition. This ensures that not only do the Liberals stay in power until 2025, but also in 2025, if we have an election and a minority conservative government is elected, they can actually run a no confidence vote and get that government booted out. So guys, we're stuck with the NDP and Liberals for the foreseeable future. And they're starting to understand how much power they have, because they're saying shit like this now.
Can you tell us, how important is this question of making sure that the bill doesn't infringe on charter rights and freedom of expression when it comes to reworking it?
Fundamental. It's at the core of what we're doing. Freedom of speech is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental human right. But I'll tell you something else. Actually, there's a lot of people that don't want to share what they think anymore. They're afraid of going online and speak freely because of the comments, the negative and violent reaction they may get. And I think in some ways, this will really help freedom of speech in that sense.
And also shit like this.
So do you support provinces cutting gasoline taxes, or does that undermine the role of and the intent of higher carbon pricing?
It does goes against our efforts to fight climate change, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we've gone through a pandemic. There is a terrible crisis happening right now in Ukraine. We're seeing inflation, but all of these crises will go. And climate change will still be there. And climate change is killing people in Canada. 700 deaths last year in BC alone related to the heat domes. A 200% increase in heat-related deaths.
So you wish provinces were not reducing their gas taxes?
Exactly.
Stephen Guilbeault explicitly said he wants you to suffer with high fuel prices to virtue signal his support for the environment. He's okay with $2 to $3 fuel prices. He's okay with families having to choose between putting fuel in their vehicles to drive to work, to make money to pay for fuel and food, and actually putting food in their mouths. He's okay with families having to make that choice. He explicitly just said that. Then we've got the Heritage Minister talking about how he has to squash free speech. He's saying we need to step on free speech, despite it being a fundamental human right, his own words. We need to squash free speech in the spirit of maintaining free speech. So what they consider free speech, I mean, definitions are important here. Their definition of free speech is the speech that they like. Because I'll tell you, his description of people who don't want to speak up, he's not talking about me. He's not talking about you, who's afraid to lose your job if you fight back. He's not talking about you guys. He's talking about the people who say what he wants them to say and how they're so uncomfortable talking about what they want to talk about, despite spending years now trashing people like me, getting people like me fired from their jobs, getting people canceled for the simple fact that they spoke up and they had something to say. Let's not forget that time Canadians weren't okay with being locked down for 2 years and having their lives destroyed, and they decided to protest. And the government enacted a war times measure, the Emergencies Act, to stop this protest, and then sent a bunch of goons in to beat the living shit out of everybody who was protesting and shut these protests down. And they were going to freeze bank accounts, and they did freeze bank accounts. They were going to just destroy people's lives for the simple fact that they disagreed with government action and they wanted to push back on it. So let's not forget that part either. That's a massive escalation in suffering of Canadians, if you ask me. So it feels like a shift to me. This feels like a shift. It feels like we've shifted from having a government that was trash, who didn't care about Canadians and wanted to virtue signal, to a government who is now, the tone feels like it's changed, a government who's now explicitly asking that we all suffer and forcing us to all suffer in the spirit of their massive virtue signal. Feels good, doesn't it? Anyways, I just wanted to point that out to you guys. This NDP Liberal coalition government that we have, and again, they don't call it that. This is going to be the most miserable thing that ever happened to Canada. At every turn, they will choose to virtue signal despite any amount of suffering that it causes Canadian families, rather than do what's right for the people of Canada, rather than support our industries, rather than ensure people have good jobs. The amount of debt being shoveled onto the shoulders of our children is massive. This one government in 4 to 5 years has put enough debt on the shoulders of the next generations that my kids, their kids, their kids' kids, and their kids' kids are still going to be paying for this shit. 5 years they did this, guys. If they're not aiming to absolutely obliterate Canadian society, if that's not completely obvious to you, I don't know how to make it any more obvious at this point.